Hello, friends, and welcome to the February 8th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Engagement Director, and today's episode is brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas. And I am particularly excited about today's episode. We'll be featuring Beeman Floyd talking to us about the Texas state budget. We'll also be joined by Josh Houston with our legislative update and action alert of the week. But first, to help us put a theological frame on the conversation, I'm excited to welcome my friend and Texas Impact board member, Reverend Paul Klitzke with the Episcopal Church of the Ascension-Dallas for this week's Weekly Word. Paul, take it away.
Thank you so much. Perhaps you even hear the church bells tolling here at Ascension as we begin. Let us pray. Be present with us, God of all creation. Though we are scattered, we know you are here. We come carrying the concerns of our lives. We come holding our sorrow. We come sharing the grief and wounds of others. We come asking that you meet us here in our brokenness. We come to lament the ways in which we've failed and confess our shortcomings and our missteps. We come seeking you. Stay with us, God. Guide us continually as we begin to open ourselves to listen, to seek, and share your grace. As I prepared for our time here and thinking that we would have a chance to talk state budgets, I was reminded of Matthew 6. Now, Matthew 6 has a ton of stuff in it, where Jesus instructs the disciples on how to pray, and we carry forward the Lord's Prayer from that and so much. He speaks of how to give alms in secret rather than proclaiming it as you do so. And it is where we have this great verse about where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And whether you're Christian or of another faith tradition, I do think that we could agree that how we spend money is a theological statement. It's a statement of priorities, and it's a statement of how we expect our world to be. And so budgets are an important aspect for our churches, for our communities. And so I'm glad to be discussing it and encouraging others to participate in that process. And I would like to offer an additional prayer as we endeavor to do just that. Almighty God, show us that reconciling with those we imagine are different from us is not only for peace, but also to train us more deeply in the faith that honors everything created by your hand. Help us see that reconciliation leads to deeper knowledge of you. Amen.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for the time and for your continued leadership here in the great state of Texas. Appreciate that.
Thanks for having me.
Next, we'll welcome to the conversation Beeman Floyd, who to many of you needs no introduction, but I did ask him today which hat he was wearing today. And I think my favorite is our former colleague Katie Floyd's dad. So, but he is here with us today as a Texas Impact legislative consultant. Beeman Floyd is the perfect person to talk to Texans of faith about the importance of the state budget and how we can engage in those conversations, what we should be watching for. So Beeman, thanks for the time today.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so let's start. The state budget is the one must-pass bill for the Texas legislature, and the comptroller estimates that the legislature will have about $112 billion, which is real money, right, to spend at current rates for the next 2-year biennium. So could you explain the budgeting process and what advocates should be watching for during this very unique budget cycle?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a couple of things about the Texas state budget that are really important and that make it distinct from the federal budget, which is kind of another thing we watch, or your local budgets, which is a thing you watch. The federal budget, as I think we all know, deals in budget deficits that in every year, sort of miraculously to me, we spend way more money than we actually take in tax revenue. The idea is that economic growth is sort of will ultimately sort of catch up with that. And so people who look at federal budgets don't look at whether or not we're spending more money than we have, but they're looking at the scale of budget growth in proportion to economic growth. And so we talk about the national debt a lot, and we talk about the deficit a lot, which is that per year what we're adding to the national debt. In local governments, we have local budgets, but what you have a lot of in local jurisdictions is fees and fees for service, right? So you have your budget is supplemented a whole lot by things like if you live in a place with municipal water service, you have water fees, you have various kinds of service fees, you have licensing fees, you have different permit fees, parking, whatever, and tickets. And you also have bonding. Local governments use a lot of bonding to sort of make the capital parts of their budgets, where they will issue these bonds. And so that's sort of the building blocks of budgets in that space. The state budget in Texas is kind of interesting. It really, the most important, the big middle of the state budget is real live revenue from two sources. One is from the myriad of taxes that we have in the state, and you all pay them all the time. You know what I'm talking about. You've got sales taxes, and you've got motor fuel taxes, and you've got those of you who have a lot of oil wells have severance taxes that you pay when you pump oil out of the ground, and the like, right? So we've got this sort of you pay every time you buy an insurance policy, you pay state insurance taxes on that, and then the other place we get a lot of our state budget money is federal dollars. We're involved in many different kinds of federal matching grants, and this is a thing that is soft pedaled sometimes by Texas politicians when they are talking about the virtue of Texas. But the fact is that almost half of our budget comes from federal money and federal matching grants. That's why you can have something like a $220 to $230 billion budget with $112 billion of tax revenue. Well, that's where the rest of that money is coming from, right? But the other thing that's really important, the important thing related to that with the Texas state budget is that we cannot constitutionally deficit spend on our budget. Our budget actually has to balance. And so when we talk about the amount of money available for things in the Texas state budget, it's actually pretty critical because we can't say, well, let's just run a big old deficit this year. And because it's such a big and complicated and prospective thing, the basic fundamental building block of our budget is the Comptroller of Texas, Glenn Hager, he's an elected official, certifies the amount of money that will be available in a budget cycle. And he has done that thing. When you use the money, $112 billion, the question is, where does that come from? And is that money we have? And the answer is, no, not really. It's the money that we predict will be the revenue in this coming biennium. So it basically sets the amount that the state appropriation can be from general revenue into the budget process. Then we figure out how much federal dollars we're going to get. And then we figure out the state also charges fees, as you guys know. We pay a driver's license fee and we pay things like that. So there's a fee schedule, there's federal money, there are certain investment accounts that we have that yield dollars to certain things. But the big middle is this tax revenue, and this tax revenue that is generated by the economic activity of the state. That has been certified. So now both the House and the Senate, who have been working on some assumptions about that, are just now launching into the budget process. The budget process involves the Senate Finance Committee and the House Appropriations Committee. Senate Finance Committee has already scheduled a bunch of hearings. They start this week and will be every day. And I'll give you guys some websites information that we will post, hopefully, in our page. The first one is capital.state.tx.us. You can go there and look at all of the different hearings and the hearing schedule, and you can watch the hearings online. So if you are geeked up about the budget, great news. You've got at least a 60-hour miniseries getting ready to start right now in terms of the Senate Finance deliberations on the budget. We just got a House Appropriations Committee this past week. The new Speaker of the House appointed new committees. The new chairman of Appropriations is Representative/Dr. Greg Bonin. He's a neurosurgeon from down in Friendswood, near to Galveston. And he is very smart, somewhat veteran. You may recognize the name. He is the actual first degree of consanguinity brother of Dennis Bonin, the immediate past Speaker of the House. Greg Bonin is going to be the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And they will soon establish a set of hearings that will begin, and you'll have this mirror process of the Senate Finance Committee on one side of the Capitol and the House Appropriations Committee on the other side of the Capitol doing their work. That mirror process has already started. Both houses of the Texas legislature have published a budget, and that budget will have a lot of similarities and certain differences. They will work on their versions of the budget. They will pass their versions of the budget. Those two things will cross each other in the rotunda of the Capitol, and then the House will substitute its budget for the Senate budget, and the Senate will substitute its budget for the House budget. There will be differences. And then those differences will be worked out in a peculiar and wonderful device called a conference committee, where a small number, usually 5 people, will be named from the House and 5 will be named from the Senate, and they will get together to reconcile the differences in the two bills. So most of what's happening in the bills will be, in something big like the budget, the preponderance of what you're looking at will be very similar, but there will be critical differences, some of them policy differences, some of them detailed differences, some of them accounting differences, that very small group of people will need to work on. They will come to an agreement, hopefully. And then if they come to an agreement, that ultimately their agreement will be subject to a final vote up or down by both houses. And sometime around 2 days left in the legislative session, we'll have a budget.
Yeah, so the budget is big and complicated. It's not like, I oppose House Bill X number, right? So what advice do you give our advocates who, we're encouraging folks to be meeting with their legislators now and throughout the legislative session. What advice do you give our listeners who are interested in meeting with their legislators on the budget specifically?
Well, the first is the budget helps you. There's an index to the budget. And so, yes, it is ginormous and extremely complicated. But there are some broad stripes that are easily communicated. I was going to say communicable. I guess we've been in the pandemic for too long. But easy to communicate about the budget. The budget is broken up into 9 distinct articles. But there are the big 3. And the big 3 articles are Health and Human Services, Education, and Transportation. Health and Human Services is Article 2. Education is Article 3. And those are sort of the wheelhouse of where Texas Impact does its work, right? It is also true that transportation is an increasingly distant third in those expenditures. We spend very much most of our budget on Articles 2 and 3, Health and Human Services and Education. So the first way you can sort of refine your knowledge as a member is to decide what you're really interested in, right? And if you're interested in social justice issues as they are expressed economically, right? As our devotion says, how we spend money is a spiritual practice, right? So if you're interested in health and welfare and child welfare and things that are happening in the Health and Human Services Department of Texas, then go love on Article 2 and look at it and think about it. That same website that I described, where you can look at hearing schedules, you can actually look at bill text and figure it out. And I think our bill is Senate Bill 1 this year. Josh will jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's sort of going to be the controlling bill of the budget this year. So you can go to that bill and look at Article 2 and start to sort of see the ups and downs, or you can Google it up and look at literature and see where expenditures are being made, where they're being increased or decreased. If your thing is pub ed, public education and higher education, and the Texas School for the Deaf and the Texas School for the Blind, and basically all things education, you go to Article 3. And Article 3 will be that portion of that expansive, ginormous bill that will be dealing with those expenditures. The bills themselves are pretty dry. You have to know a lot about the budget to understand what you're looking at in the budget, because you've got this sort of snapshot in the budget, but it exists in time, right? That you have changes and you have comparisons and all that kind of thing. So that literature requires some more research, right? That you have to say, are we increasing funding for education or decreasing it? Are we starving health and human services? Or are we recognizing issues and pumping it up? So that's a different kind of research, but this is the important part. These terms that I've used, that although they're not immediately illuminating, like Article 2 and Article 3, and the comptroller's revenue estimate and these things. Familiarization with those terms and this basic technical framework of how you do the budget goes a long way toward giving you credibility when you're talking to legislators. It's like if you walk into a mechanic's shop and they say, well, you may have a little issue with your car. And you say, well, yeah, I think it may be a fuel injector problem. I can say that, and I don't have the first clue how a fuel injector works. I will confess to you right away, I'm an old carburetor man, and that's where my logic stops, right? But by saying it and sort of understanding the concept of fuel injector and understanding that my car is missing or whatever, maybe I convey to the mechanic that I'm not a complete idiot, and he can't tell me I need new Johnson rods for my car when they don't exist, right? And by the same token, when you've got when you can demonstrate a little bit of good faith knowledge as a constituent and a citizen, that you understand how these things work by knowing some of the terms, by familiarizing yourself with what they're actually working in, it's helpful. It shows some respect for what they're doing, shows that you have cared to educate yourself a little bit. And it will cause the ears of legislators and, very importantly, staff to prick up a little bit. If you say, my real issue is in Article 3, instead of, just sort of a education for the kids. If you say my real issue is in Article 3 because I really believe in education for the kids, you've done a thing. And so that's why the sort of technical framework is actually kind of helpful for you as an advocate when you're talking to members and staff. Then you say what you want about it. Then you go and talk about one of the things I love about working with and for Texas Impact is there's a lot of reliance on just who you are and what you think. There's never sort of a prescribed notion of what you should say or advocate. It is a let the people of faith loose and good will come of it. And so then go and speak your heart.
Oh, that's a really good and helpful overview. And this is something we'll be keeping an eye on throughout session. I know we've outlined our weekly witness episodes throughout the 20 weeks of session, and we have 2 of them designated for the budget. And so we'll come back and kind of look at this again in a couple of weeks once some of those hearings have taken place. Any closing thoughts from you today, Beam?
Yeah, I would say 3 things. The first thing is that the revenue estimate is not as bad as we thought it was, but interestingly, both the House and the Senate budgets are for $7 billion more than the revenue estimate. They're for about 119 bills. And you may say to yourself, well, how can that be? Because at the top, Beeman said, we're not allowed to have a deficit budget. And the answer is we're expecting federal dollars to come out of Washington in direct aid to states with regard to the economic flattening or downturn that has come from the COVID pandemic. And so there is some communication there. The second is the Health and Human Services and education budgets are just neck and neck. And those are both historically ginormous sort of co-equal priorities for Texas Impact. And the third, so that's fertile ground for y'all to pick what's important to you. The third is that education, we increased our commitment to education last session fairly significantly in House Bill 5. You all may recall the news where we actually got a school finance bill and a non-lawsuit moment, which is totally weird. In other words, a court wasn't telling the legislature they had to do something for public ed, they just kind of did it. Though there is plenty of tension between actual on-the-ground public educators and superintendents and the TEA and the legislature, all the tension you ever wanted in the world, believe me. The fact is that this budget honors the commitments that were made in House Bill 5. And so there is a precious moment here of being able to walk into a legislator's office if education is your thing and saying, we appreciate that you're honoring that commitment. Now, please keep doing it and we need more, but if that's how you feel. Yeah. But there's a good faith effort to meet the commitments from last session, notwithstanding the pandemic. And so that was a little bit of a moment for the public education world to say, wow, that's really a thing. That being said, in public education specifically, and I'm almost there, in public education specifically, there is going to be a huge issue related to whether or not we recognize that the pandemic is an ongoing problem and we bridge funding for public education for enrollment decreases that they have suffered as a result of the pandemic. A lot of elementary school parents have kept their kids home and are homeschooling them now. And that changes as you get up into the high school space. We're dealing with a whole brand new world of virtual learning and how to count that as attendance.
Right.
And the sort of shorthand for the entire budget thing with PubEd at this point is the yes or no question that you can make out of this incredibly complicated moment is, will the legislature fund a hold harmless for schools? That is, will they fund them at a sort of assumed level of attendance while we sort out what the real results of the pandemic are going to be? Or are they going to say, hey, the rules are the rules, you have less attendance, we're going to cut your budget? And that is like the question. Most people who advocate for public education are saying, legislature, you have to grant a hold harmless because it's a world of chaos, right? It changes day to day. And we've got to find a way to sort out the pandemic and its effect on these very technical systems with a predictable level of funding while we sort through it and while we recover from it. And so that hold harmless in education is sort of the first big 1 or 0 in the budget talk on Article 3. So
I thought about that public education piece every time I received a panicked email from the school district reminding me as a parent to log the attendance of my two children while they were doing school from home. So,
Yeah, my wife is a high school teacher, and the reason I'm sitting in my office is that my house is a multiple classroom right now, and her students don't want to hear what I'm saying to you guys right now. They want to learn from her. So,
well, I'm sure they would have appreciated as much as we have. So, thank you so much for the time, and we'll look forward to hearing from you and other advocates about the budget as we go throughout this legislative session. So thanks for all you do, Beeman.
Okay, very good. Thank you for having me. You bet.
And I do see we have some questions, and we'll see if Josh might address some of those during his piece here momentarily. So I'm going to welcome to the conversation Josh Houston for our legislative update for the week. Josh, always nice to follow Beeman, right?
Yeah, it is.
So Josh, you will remember, it seems like forever ago that you and I last talked, but during our conversation, or at least on recording, right? But last Monday, you previewed the state of the state that the governor spoke last Monday evening. So I know it's been a week. It might seem like old news by now, but what did we learn from that address?
Well, yeah, the most important thing about the state of the state is that that's really the governor's moment. And then the governor exits stage left, not entirely, but he's not the focal point. The legislature becomes the focal point for the rest of session before the governor steps back on stage during the veto period after sine die. So that is the governor's moment to kind of say what he or she, or in this case he obviously, thinks is most important. The thing to note about it from a policy perspective is that the Texas Constitution sets aside the first 60 days of a legislative session for bill filing. Unless, and here's the big unless the governor has named a topic to be an emergency item. And this is always true. What constitutes an emergency is a bit flexible. The definition of such, it's always been every governor. This is a thing that is debated, but it's just the way we do things in Texas. And so what we heard, when I listen for it, I always listen for what the governor says is going to be an emergency item, because that enables the legislature, if the legislature so chooses, to take it up early and move on it before the first 60 days. So there were 5 things. 1, expanding broadband access is one. 2, laws to prevent defunding the police. 3, bail reform. And the thing to pay attention to is how is that worded? I think there are many advocates who mean one thing by bail reform, and it is a little unclear whether the governor meant the exact opposite or whether there's some sort of balance to be struck in how they do bail reform. I think that's for the legislature to work out, and we'll see. Just a thing to watch in the days ahead. 4, election integrity, which we're going to talk a little more about here in a second. And then 5, business liability protections against lawsuits for COVID-related lawsuits. Those were the 5 things that the governor named that the legislature could work on. Should the legislature so choose. But I want to remind listeners that the legislature is a co-equal branch of government, and the legislature gets to decide what they think are emergencies as much as anybody else. And so that's kind of the space we've moved into since the state of the state.
So the other thing that we've been watching for weeks was when the speaker would release the House committee assignments. Those came out last week. Is there anything in particular that you learned from those, and what should listeners do with that information?
Well, one of the most powerful moments for the speaker in that office is when the speaker names and appoints the committees, both the number and it's really the big design that's going to set the tenor for the rest of session. It's pretty much right on time, a little early. I think sometimes you get them in early February, and we did. It kind of varies. But with every new speaker, and I think here's the point we want to make, with every new speaker, there's going to be a reshuffle of the deck, so to speak, of who is in leadership as the speaker constructs a leadership team. Of course, all 150 members get one vote when a thing comes to the floor, but when you go to design the committee process, that's where a lot of informal power gets created. Naming and appointing committees elevates some members over others. We're not going to get into the gossip of all that. If you're curious, just go ask your member. Often if you ask, hey, what do you think about committees? They'll often tell you. We're not going to get into all that because we're focused on policy. And so from here on, everything I say is about policy. Please check out where your member, your legislator, got appointed. That is a super important thing to know because that is where your legislator is going to be spending a lot of time and developing expertise. So we divide up work by committee, and each committee gets subject matter jurisdiction, and that is how we divide up work. No member can be an expert on all things. That's just impossible. So where your committee, where your elected official is spending time is in their committee, and that is going to be their area of expertise. It's also the perch from which they can advance their own bills. It is where they're able to wheel and deal, frankly, a little bit to be able to move their own bills or not be able to move their own bills because of where they've been appointed and just kind of the natural processes of any legislative body. A few high-level observations I'll make. It certainly appears that committees have been constructed for debate. I think that's how we want to say it. There are a number of Democrats that are in some powerful spots and powerful committees. And there are a number of what you might say, what we used to call the Tea Party or the Freedom Caucus or the most conservative wing of the Republican Party who've also been put in some pretty powerful spots. And so what that really means is that there's going to be quite a bit of debate is how they're structured to be. A lot of the past systems of management have been minimized. So what I'm trying to say at a high level is it really looks like some power has been diffused. And an open question is, does that mean if everybody is kind of bought in, does that minimize some disruption that has often happened from isolating some members? Or does that debate lead to rancor and acrimony? And that's an open question. We'll just have to see. There's no way to know that in advance. I bring that up because there's a number of committees that are going to be of interest. Some changes occurred. Public education, appropriations, redistricting all saw some leadership changes. The one we probably want to talk about because it affects policy in the here and now is elections. Because the governor made election integrity an emergency item, we have to pay attention to the elections committee right away. A lawyer who this is all in the news, Texas Tribune, nothing insider info here you couldn't read for yourself. A lawyer who worked for the Trump campaign in Pennsylvania is a legislator who's been made chair of that committee. I think the general consensus is that it will be a challenging committee. Let's stay tuned. Some open questions that we're watching that we don't have answers for. I want to make clear is when does that committee have its first organizational hearing? So every committee will have an organizational hearing where they call in various experts to come kind of testify to get the committee up to speed on the basic issues the committee's facing for that session. How quick does that occur? What is the tenor of it? And then do we see bills immediately posted after the organizational hearing for the week after that? How quick does this committee get moving? Do we start to see rapid movement on those things that are emergency items or not? And if we see rapid movement in this committee, does that affect the rest of session? Often election bills are very partisan, and does moving a lot of partisan, and this is a big if a bunch of partisan bills get moving in that committee in a hurry, does that create partisan acrimony that is disruptive for the rest of session? These are all questions we just don't know the answer to at this time.
So let's talk about that a little more, because your blog post last week talked about how session this year might be different because of concerns about COVID-19. And so what is committee testimony going to look like, and how might that change kind of how session works?
So yeah, there are a lot of unanswered questions about how the committee process will work, even still. We have rules, we have conversations. We just don't know how often the chairs of the committee will do virtual testimony. It has to be by invite, but how do these invites get given out? How many, how often, how much is the will of other legislators on the committee requesting certain people be invited? How often are those honored? We just don't know the answers to that. It's a wait and see. But if you've ever been to testify, I know I've often gotten asked, we have often asked many of you to come testify on bills before. And I have ever fielded this question, and I'm paraphrasing, but variations on why am I doing this? What's the point? What are we trying to achieve? And the answer is complicated. It depends. There are many, many reasons to testify on legislation. Often it ranges. You could be making a good bill better. You could be making a meh bill into a good bill. You could be trying to make a bad bill into a palatable bill. There are all sorts of variations on that. And sometimes you have bills that are a fait accompli. And so that's, I think, often when we kind of get the question, why are we coming to talk for 2 or 3 minutes, however many were allotted? What's the point? There are only 8 weeks, give or take. You can debate the number, but around 8 weeks, where a committee can really do work with the bills that originate in that chamber. So this is critical. There are, on average, in a week, about 8 hours for that committee. If you think about real work and time, the constraints, give or take. About 1 hearing per week produces about 1 week's worth of work for staff. Those are just some of the human constraints of a session. I mean, I guarantee you, because Beeman can affirm this, we watch committee clerks just stretch the limits of human endurance. Working very long hours in literally windowless rooms, getting these committee reports churned out and doing the paperwork and trying to just do the necessary work to move legislation. Why am I going into this detail? Well, because if you can really only spend, how are you going to spend your week is exactly what each chair of each committee is having to calculate and think about. And if you were in the past, when you would have a lot of public testimony, on a very controversial item, if that controversial bill is going to take up 8 hours of testimony, you have to account for that in your calculation. So if you spend a whole week doing one big controversial bill, that's 30 non-controversial bills that they could have been doing instead. And that means that there's 20 to 30 legislators that are trying to get their non-controversial bills moving through that committee. And if you have too many controversial bills, they begin to wonder, why is my bill not moving in this committee? Why is there a bottleneck? Why is this committee chair spending all this time on super partisan or super controversial red meat and not just doing the work that my district needs done? So that's the balance that each committee chair has to take into account. So it's a huge, in the past, public testimony is a huge deterrent for doing super controversial. But if we're not having big public testimony because of COVID-19, that firewall is down. And so I think a big open question is, how quick do very controversial things get a pass or get to move in a hurry in a sense that they wouldn't have in a normal session?
So in future weeks, we will have an action alert that we present at the end of Weekly Witness, where we talk about bills that'll be heard during the course of the week and telephone calls that we hope people will make. And that time is coming soon, friends. So mentally prepare yourself for that. So Josh, is there anything you would leave us with today that you hope people will do in the next week? And Beeman, if you'd like to offer a thought there too, I'd welcome you back into the conversation. But what do you hope people will do over the course of the next week?
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate that the first 60 days is for bill filing. which means we're off to it. It's always a slow start. That's completely normal, which means now is the time to get their attention. Once we get into committee season, which really begins usually, beware the Ides of March, they say, if you are a Shakespeare fan. Right in the middle of March is when we really get into the peak committee season. At that point, their concentration, the time you get just gets constricted and constricted and constricted and constricted and constricted all the way up to sine die. So the time to meet with them about anything is right now. You can get legislators' attention right now. If you want a more specific thing, you know your relationship best with your legislator or with the staff of your legislator, but it's kind of worth it just to give them a call and say, hey, what do you think about committees? Leave it open-ended, and see what they tell you. And please let me know what they say, because this is the kind of thing that in a normal session, I would be doing, hanging out in the Capitol Grill or in the hallway. But it's, hey, is this the idle conversation you make? Hey, what did you think? And they'll often just tell you. And in a normal session, I would be doing that, but I can't. We can't this time around. So to the extent you're willing and able, and hey, what do you think about committees? Please do it. It would be very helpful to know what individual members think and if they're pleased or not pleased, or that kind of gossip thing we're not going to get into here. And also, it's just important to do because that is where the member is going to be focused. And you want to know what that member thinks about their committee appointments, because that is where they're going to spend a lot of time and build a lot of expertise. And if it's an issue area you care about, even more reason that you really want to go ahead and have that conversation now, because depending on where your member is at, it's not just the member that's powerful. It is the district that becomes powerful as well. So if you happen to have a member on, say, calendars, then your member has a say in which bills make it to the House floor and which bills just never do. So you, in a sense, have an obligation as a constituent in a district with a member on calendars to help out other people of faith that are in other districts that may not have that same committee appointment.
Josh, we did get go ahead, Beeman.
Yeah, actually, I was going to say one more thing, and it popped up wisely in the question space as well. The thing I was going to say, and agree with everything Josh is saying in terms of engaging in that conversation. I think also in a fundamental way, you can just say, hey, we're really interested. We're interested in good, constructive engagement with your office, but we know this session is super weird. What's the best way to engage with you right now? And I think that does a couple of things that are really good. One, it just gives critical data to us. We're trying to figure that out now with offices all over the Capitol. Is how do you guys actually want to meet? And we have really encountered everything from, send us an email and we really don't want that too much because we're freaked out about this whole COVID thing, to we want you to show up in person proudly and let us sneeze on you because liberty. And so, it's really crazy right now down at the Capitol. It's hard to tell how to do our work. But if you as constituents just say, hey, we respect that this is as difficult for you as anybody trying to do a hard job in a particular way. Legislature is very, in-person thing, and yikes. What's the best way for us to communicate with you? They may give you their cell phone number. Or they will say, we really prefer emails and we have a system for fielding those. Or they will say, text my chief of staff and that's how we're distributing in the office. Here's their cell phone number or whatever, right? And so, but you having that information is really valuable, and you helping us sort of build the big information sheet is super valuable, so that we can know how to get to these folks when it gets real. After 60 days is up, as Josh was saying, when we flip over from bill filing into action.
Yeah, so now is the time for that relationship building, right? We're not coming necessarily with big asks right now. The time for that will come in the course of the next few weeks. But building that relationship with that legislative office now is really important. We hope folks will take the time over the course of this first 60 days to schedule Zoom meetings or have conversations with their offices about the best way to stay in touch. So, Josh, Beeman, thank you all so much for the time today. Thanks for the conversation, and we'll look forward to continuing it with you all in the weeks to come. Any closing thoughts from either of you? All right. Well, friends, thank you so much for tuning in. As we prepare to close out today, I want to remind you of 3 opportunities to learn more and to participate in this process. First, many of you have joined Texas Impact's Rapid Response Team. I hope that you'll consider doing that. We'll be releasing Monday action alerts, but things change between Mondays. And so if you want to know when it's important for you to contact your member, whether it be because they're on a committee that's hearing a priority piece of legislation or they just really need an extra bump on something, please register for that rapid response team so you can receive an email and or a text message when that time comes. If you want to take the next step by joining a legislative engagement group, we'd encourage you to do that, to be paired up with other advocates of faith in your district so you can hold each other accountable and work together to build a relationship with your district office. Those groups have been meeting Monday afternoons for a little extra conversation with Texas Impact staff after Weekly Witness. I see several of you have asked questions in the chat section that we'll try to address during that legislative engagement group time. You can sign up to be on Texas Impact's Rapid Response Team or legislative engagement group at texasimpact.org. Click on the Action Center link, and there are places to sign up there. If you have questions, you can always email me at scott@texasimpact.org. Texas Interfaith Advocacy Days is coming up March 6th through 9th. That will be online this year. And so we hope you'll register soon to see all of the great speakers, get great content, and figure out how you can engage with the Texas State Legislature. Again, learn more at texasimpact.org or by emailing me. And if you appreciate the work of Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact. Our work is supported by members like you, so make sure that you have joined. You can do that at texasimpact.org/join. Y'all, the legislature is in session, and we need you and your congregations active and engaged. Thanks for your time today, and let's get to work.